On September 16, 1989, this grocery store in Webster, Texas, now an empty lot across from Burger King, had an unusual visitor, the soon-to-be president of Russia. Over the previous week, Boris Yeltsin had toured the Statue of Liberty, US Capitol, and Houston Space Center. But none of that impressed him quite like this unscheduled visit to a nondescript supermarket. What amazed Yeltsin as he strolled past fully stocked aisles of frozen peas and spaghetti was just how normal it all was. None of the middle-class suburban shoppers he chatted with seemed in awe of the store's abundant selection of 30-some thousand items. For them, it was just another Saturday. He concluded that if his hungry, choice-deprived Soviet comrades could see what he saw, they'd start a revolution. Well, 30 years later, the shoe is now on the other foot. The 21st century equivalent to Yeltsin's grocery awakening might be an American's first encounter with Chinese high-speed rail. Close your eyes and throw 2 darts on a map of China, a country almost exactly the same size as the United States, and odds are you can travel between them, in comfort, at 200 miles an hour. There are now 31,000 miles of high-speed tracks, more than the entire rest of the world combined. Enough to cross the continental United States east to west nearly 12 times over. The trip between Beijing and Shanghai, for instance, takes about 4.5 hours, and you don't have to worry about flight delays or airport security. The equivalent journey in America, New York to Chicago, takes 12 hours by car, or for the truly patient, 20 by train. For decades, visitors to China have marveled at its built environment. The lightning-fast trains, the futuristic skylines, and the shiny, colossal bridges. Just recently, there's been a high-profile wave of these visits as the country attempts to accelerate the very slow post-pandemic recovery of its tourism industry. And as Yeltsin discovered, there's something powerful, even radicalizing, about seeing others take for granted what you've been told is impractical or even impossible. Watching your fellow passengers play Angry Birds with complete indifference as if they weren't racing across the vast Tibetan plateau at 200 miles an hour. Meanwhile, $15 billion has already been spent connecting LA and San Francisco. After 16 years of lawsuits, false starts, and controversy, it's still unclear whether the project will ever see the light of day. China's success here is undeniable. It clearly deserves credit for delivering on such a massive undertaking, particularly since the wealthiest nation on Earth so conspicuously has not. What's less clear, however, is whether it offers a lesson the rest of the world should emulate. Just as, for example, America's incredibly high per capita GDP fails on its own to capture the trade-offs and weaknesses of its economic model, so too does the speed and scale of China's dazzling infrastructure miss some important context. The hidden costs absorbed by those who actually live in the country and that remain largely invisible to you and I as visitors. Sponsored by Nebula, the exclusive home to my brand new 3-part series, A Grand Theory of Xi Jinping. Here's a puzzle. How do consumers in China, a developing country, spend as much on luxury goods as those in America, the richest nation on the planet? Now consider that 85% of the Chinese population has, at most, a high school education. 85%. Education, to be fair, is a very crude proxy for wealth. Still, it's hard to believe the non-college educated workforce is buying all these luxury watches, Cartier bracelets, and designer handbags. The only way to reconcile these two divergent facts is extreme inequality. One segment of the population, 15% if we use college as a benchmark, is living a life on par with an upper-middle-class New Yorker or Parisian. They buy overpriced lattes, live in high-rise apartments with doormen, and work in white-collar offices surrounded by beanbags. The rest of the country is lucky to finish high school, which in China isn't free, and may never in their lives earn even half the minimum wage in West Virginia. In the United States, public schools are largely funded by local property taxes, meaning wealthier areas have better teachers, facilities, and opportunities. China has that same unequal system, except it goes one step further. Virtually all public programs are paid for at the local, not national level, from pensions to unemployment, healthcare, and education. Meaning the entire social safety net varies by region. Not even the poorest province is subsidized by the richest. And you can't just move. These geographic disparities are enshrined in law. 50 years ago, many Chinese workers, like their Soviet counterparts, were guaranteed employment, pensions, and benefits at state-run companies, in a system known as the Iron Rice Bowl. Both China and Russia suddenly ended this practice in the 90s, causing tremendous chaos. And both worried these millions of angry unemployed workers could rise up and threaten their grip on power. Russia's solution, pioneered by Vladimir Putin, involved striking a deal with elites. They'd be allowed to buy all these newly privatized, formerly state-owned companies at rock-bottom prices, to steal from the public treasury, to bribe officials, and even assassinate their competition. There was just one red line they couldn't cross: layoffs. A worker might be losing his company money while releasing asbestos into the environment for no discernible purpose, but he should never, ever be fired. China took a different approach, opting to rip the Band-Aid off immediately. Its 30 million plus laid-off workers were left on their own. They had to pack their bags, migrate to wherever there were jobs, and hopefully figure something out. To stop this sudden migrant influx from overwhelming the social safety net in the cities they moved to, China simply banned these workers, its own citizens, from accessing the public services their taxes paid for. This had the added benefit of preventing them from putting down roots, ensuring a permanent supply of cheap labor, a permanent underclass. To this day, Chinese citizens are registered in their place of birth in a kind of state-enforced caste system. Changing that registration, called hukou, is nearly impossible for poor rural workers. The professor and Chinese labor scholar Eli Friedman calls this an inverted welfare state. Workers have to prove they're rich enough that they don't need social services before they can access social services. The rich get things for free, while the poor pay out of pocket. Rural-born mothers and fathers working in cities must choose, for example, either to leave their child behind to be raised by their grandparents, or bring them and pay tuition at one of the low-performing private schools for migrant children. Meanwhile, not only do taxes fail to compensate for this inequality, they actively make it worse. Because China imposes a minimum social security contribution, the lowest earners are taxed at the highest rate. Top 1% earners pay about the same rate as those in the bottom 20. As a result, personal income taxes make up just 1% of China's GDP, a drop in the bucket, compared to 10% in the US. And despite most household wealth being tied up in real estate, there's no property or inheritance tax. China is one of the most unequal countries on the planet. And this is not merely a flaw or oversight. It's an essential component of its economic system. You do not get the 31,000 miles of high-speed rail without this labor exploitation that makes it cost-effective to build. This is all part of a single economic model that prioritizes construction at the expense of wages. Cheap, abundant labor and massive, labor-intensive infrastructure are two sides of the same coin. And inequality is not the only cost. Chinese citizens of all incomes and social strata pay for their shiny bridges and lightning-fast trains in many other ways too. Organizing, for instance, is effectively illegal. The only legal union, if you can call it that, is the All China Federation of Trade Unions, which answers to the government, not labor. When workers at a Honda factory in Guangdong began striking in 2010 in response to low pay and dangerous conditions, for example, the union sided with their employer. And where labor laws do exist, they're rarely enforced. The average Chinese worker now clocks in 47 hours a week, about the same as in 2006, more than every OECD nation except Turkey, and nearly 80% more than a worker in the Netherlands. With such a weak safety net to fall back on, Chinese families really have no choice but to save for a rainy day. At every level of income, Chinese households save more of their wages than others around the world. But the gap is largest among the poor. They know that if they lose their jobs, suffer a health complication, or get hit by a car, they're truly on their own. This is money, in other words, that they effectively can't use. The economist Michael Pettis sums this up nicely, quote, "The high savings model forces ordinary people to spend less so that the government and businesses can spend more." He calls the Chinese government's philosophy akin to trickle-down economics. Another way Beijing redistributes wealth from households to corporations is with interest rates. The return on money deposited in banks is kept artificially low, making it cheap for companies to borrow. Meanwhile, with so few places to invest their savings, families almost universally park their wealth in property, to the benefit of large developers and the local governments that sell the land. Finally, there's currency depreciation. To keep its exports competitive, Beijing has artificially reduced the value of the renminbi. Since its currency is worth less, Americans and Brits and Australians can buy more Chinese goods, subsidizing its manufacturing industry. But this also makes imports to China more expensive, driving up the price of its consumer goods. The average worker, therefore, experiences artificially low wages and artificially high prices. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx warns of an epidemic of overproduction and underconsumption. As workers become more exploited, their wages go down, which leads to cheap, abundant production. Yet, as an increasing share of this value is captured by their bosses, they can't afford to buy the very products they're producing. That's where China finds itself today. Between 1987 and 2023, the share of labor compensation relative to economic inputs in the real economy, in other words, how much of their labor workers actually get to keep, has decreased from 21 to 15%. If Chinese workers receive the same share of their labor as those in Canada or India or France, they'd have billions more to spend on healthcare, education, and consumer goods. Instead, and as a direct result of its cheap labor, low borrowing costs, and business-friendly environment, they get high-speed trains. Some may consider this a fair trade-off, but it certainly comes at a steep cost, one that falls almost entirely on those unlucky to be born in the wrong part of the country. For years, China has been urged to stop repressing wages and give workers a more generous social safety net, thereby increasing consumption. And this criticism has been levied from both political directions. Leftist labor activists, both in and outside of the country, call on China to live up to its socialist ideals, to shift its economic model from one focused on exploitation to one that respects and honors the power of workers. Mainstream economists agree, though for different reasons. They argue China's current low-wage model, which is designed to maximize manufacturing and exports, puts it at odds with countries like the United States, which aren't always willing to absorb all these cheap imports at the expense of their own workers. A healthier, more balanced economic system would make Chinese consumers able to buy more of the things they produce. So why has China so stubbornly resisted, even going so far as to arrest Marxist and Maoist activists within its own borders? The answer to that question lies in the mind of Xi Jinping, who in 2021 warned that, quote, "We must resolutely guard against falling into the trap of supporting lazy people through welfarism." Ironically, in other words, his resistance to helping workers is not in spite of ideology, but because of it. But where does that ideology come from? If Xi is not a socialist as we typically define it, what does he believe in? Today, nearly 15 years since his rise to power, we know strikingly little about Xi, one of, if not the most powerful men on the planet. And that's why I'm releasing a brand new 3-part series titled A Grand Theory of Xi Jinping. In it, I read, watch, and synthesize nearly everything there is to know about him. From books written by those who've met him, to old archival interviews from before he became leader, to get to the bottom of who he is and how he thinks. I just released part 1 today, and it's exclusively available on today's sponsor, Nebula. And while you wait for part 2, Nebula is home to dozens more exclusives, like Modern Conflicts, in which real-life lore breaks down some of the most important wars, battles, and invasions of the 21st century, including Russia's attack on Ukraine, the rise and fall of ISIS, and the manhunt for El Chapo. And Mad Kings, mini-documentaries about the lives of men like Kim Il-sung, Muammar Gaddafi, and Nicolae Ceausescu. In this fascinating exclusive, Brian from Real Engineering CT scanned a Nokia 3310 to see what's inside and how it works. And in history's most daring raids, Real-Time History tells amazing war stories with these cool diagrams. Nebula is ad-free and even gives you guest passes so you can let your friends and family watch too for free. Normally, Nebula costs $6 a month, but you can get it for less than half that by signing up for a year with the link on screen or in the description now. That's just $30 per year, effectively $2.50 a month to watch my new exclusive series and much more. Plus, if you're not a fan of subscriptions, you can also get $200 off Nebula Lifetime with the Lifetime link below.